So Jerusalem is beginning to burst at the seams with people who are arriving for Passover. All over Judea and beyond, pilgrims are coming to celebrate and commemorate the liberation of their slave ancestors from Egypt. And since Judea and the city of Jerusalem are controlled by the Romans, security is tight and the atmosphere is volatile. Temple authorities are keenly aware that the environment is ripe for those who wish to see change. The extra-large crowds lend themselves to extra-large emotions that can flare up with just a slight trigger. During Jesus' time, there were always small crowds who plotted and planned to overthrow the Romans. Many were not happy with the temple authorities who had this pact with the empire. These small groups often used festivals like this to needle the religious authorities, who then did their best to squash these small groups' plans. So to assist the temple leaders and display their power, Rome sent their general Pilate and his troops to march in with all their glory. It is said that the Roman army could be heard from miles away as they approached the western side of the holy city. Many pilgrims would line the road to welcome the procession. And this fierce display of power was not only to impress the people who was ruling them, but also it was to display and tell the people who was God. Because the emperor was not only the military ruler of Rome and its territories, but it was law that the emperor was to be praised publicly as the Son of God. And not doing so would mean death. So for the most part, the people lived in fear. You know, as we collectively read Psalm 118 over and over as we waved our palms, we said, God's love is forever. God's love is forever. Jesus began his life in love. He lived his life in love, and he loved us even unto his death. I'm sure you have experienced times when you have entered a building, or even as you go down to the strip, you can kind of sense if this is a party atmosphere. You know the energy in the room or in the space has good vibes or not so good vibes. I have a hunch that Jesus and his disciples could sense the negative tension that was brewing in the city of Jerusalem. Maybe it was from experience, because Passover and other festivals brought out the partiers along with those wanting to make trouble. And days before as Jesus was nearing Jerusalem, some had warned him that Jerusalem wasn't a safe place for him. One of his disciples, Judas, and his buddies had hoped that if he truly was the Son of God, that he would prove his power and fight the enemy. But Jesus, though sensing the tension brewing, did not stay away, nor did he fight fire with fire, hate with hate. You know, I am from Pennsylvania, and I continue to follow Pennsylvania politics. And during the 2022 U.S. Senator race, many of us fell in love with John Fetterman and his wife, Giselle. I don't know if any of you were aware of that race at all, but John Fetterman is quite outspoken, but his wife, Giselle, is even more fierce. She supports her husband's work and does a lot on the ground. So when John had a stroke early on in the race, they didn't give up. Giselle was there to give him support. And in the end, John won. But the day after being sworn in, he checked himself, just days after being sworn in, he checked himself into Walter Reed Medical Center for clinical depression treatment. Life has been hard for this family ever since John began politics back in his town near Pittsburgh. And since her husband entered treatment, Giselle has received 10 times the amount of hate mail than her husband. Some quite vicious, and much is national. Giselle doesn't back down. She's not going to back down, and yet she says, "We can't fight fire with fire. We can't out-hate a force set on denying our essential humanity. And even if I could," she said, "I wouldn't want to carry that torch. What we can do," she goes on, "is to continue to live with love every day, to show gentleness and compassion to everyone, including ourselves." Jesus, even though folks were urging him to be more aggressive in his dissatisfaction with Roman control and the temple authorities, did not choose the sword. Nor did he choose to ride a large white steed dressed in a uniform that gleamed with power. No, Jesus planned a very humble entrance. And yes, he was proving his point of view. Love is not flashy. Love is humble. So rather than a steed, Jesus chose a donkey, and instead of a fancy saddle, his disciples made do with spare clothing. And as he began to ride slowly, because donkeys are not war horses and known to go fast, as he began to ride slowly up the road to Jerusalem, the crowd began to give him the red carpet treatment. Some spread their coats on the road before them, and others cut down branches to spread along the path. The people began to shout, "Hooray for the new King David! God's blessing is on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hooray for God, the greatest of all." All this commotion drove the pilgrims and the temple authorities crazy mad. They did not expect this. This was not your typical rebel rouser. And I can imagine that a group of Pharisees who had shown up at Jesus' ministry spots every time didn't have this on their minds as well. There had been rumors that Jesus was the Messiah, the one who would establish power and rid the nation of its oppressors. But this ragtag parade looked more silly to them than powerful. But I think that we often misunderstand power. I know that I do. And I like how Martin Luther King Jr. described it. Power, properly understood, is nothing but the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. I'm going to leave the quote up there so that you can look at that as I continue. Jesus lived his life this way, lovingly resisting the empire's abusive power, not in a sentimental way, but a life force that worked to correct and transform, always reaching out to those caught in the margins of society, always speaking out and lifting up, always shepherding and liberating. Well, not much happened after Jesus entered the city. He and his disciples look around, and he disrupts the sellers in the marketplace who are taking advantage of the worshipers. That's the table flipping one. And then he walks back to the village of Bethany. Jesus' procession, this parade into the city, was unexpected. Even his disciples didn't know Jesus' plan until just as it happened. The crowds who were following him and those who met him on the path into the city cheer like they often did as they followed Jesus, and they shouted and praised God, and they displayed their loyalty loud and clear. And yet we know how quickly they turned on him and called for his death just days later. My prayer for us today is that we would be faithful, steadfast, ever loving as Jesus. That we would mindfully enter our city, our home, our place of work, bringing a humble, loving presence. One that resists evil, correcting what stands in the way of each person, knowing they are beloved children of God. And so, my friends, may we seek out those who are brokenhearted and those whose lives are in turmoil, assuring them that you will be with them as you show God's love through your presence. And may each of us every day welcome Christ into our hearts. Amen.